recently the chief medical examiner for the state of Utah?
Yes, I retired in 2024.
How long were you the chief medical examiner?
I began working as a chief medical examiner in July of 2016.
Did you then supervise Dr. Ulmer?
I did.
Are you familiar with the death investigation for Eric Richins?
I am.
And how are you familiar with it?
I'm familiar with it from discussions with Dr. Ulmer over the time she was evaluating the case, as well as my subsequent review of the medical examiner's file.
Did you have an occasion to talk to Corey Richins?
I did.
Okay. Have you testified as an expert in forensic pathology before?
I have many times.
Okay. I would like to first talk to you about cause and manner of death and the statutory requirement for that process. When you have a death investigation, could you please explain how, I guess, what the manner of death choices are and what's the purpose of that, and just
Sure.
describe that for the jury,
Okay.
please.
So, two of the things that the medical examiner is tasked with doing under statute is determining the cause of death and the manner of death. The manner of death is a box that we check on a death certificate that is essentially a one-word synopsis of the circumstances surrounding that person's death. The options available to us, we can certify that a death is a natural death. It can be an accident, it can be a suicide, it can be a homicide, or it can be, in Utah, the death certificate reads, could not be determined, what most commonly is referred to as undetermined. And in those settings, undetermined essentially means we don't have enough information to decide which of those other four options best fits.
What's the purpose of that whole exercise?
Again, it's something that's on the death certificate, and so it's part of the vital statistics function that the medical examiner's office provides. All of the deaths that we investigate and deaths that we certify provide information then back to the state. Sometimes that's public safety, sometimes it's Department of Health. Other people will utilize that death certificate data to evaluate the ways that people are dying within the state and attempt to intervene to minimize those types of deaths.
In this particular case, were you stuck between the first four you mentioned, such that you ended up picking undetermined or cannot be determined?
Yes, again, and just to be clear, I didn't sign the death certificate, Dr. Ulmer did, but certainly was involved in discussions around that. And the determination, making a determination of undetermined means that we generally can't decide between two. In this case, I would say actually generally most cases where we certify a death as undetermined, it's because in overdose deaths that we certify as undetermined, it's because I don't know enough about the person's own intent. We see it frequently in the setting, for example, of people that may have depression or other mood disorders, and maybe even prior suicide attempts, as well as they may have substance use history that they use to self-medicate their depression and things. And so if someone overdoses on a drug that they're known to abuse, but they also have depression, if they don't leave a note or something else, then I don't really have a means of, telling just from looking at that, did they mean to do this or is it accidental, incident to their normal drug use? That's the most common scenario in which we certify a death as undetermined. In this case in specific, we did not really have any concerns about suicide in this case, but there had been concerns related to our office that perhaps someone had done something to provide this to him and that he didn't just take it himself, but we didn't know. We had no idea how he got the stuff into his system, and so with that, we were left with undetermined.
So the choice there would have been, as opposed to accident and suicide, it was accident and homicide.
Correct.
Okay. Could you describe for the jury the way in which the body processes substances? In particular, I'm looking at opiates and the different ways they can be ingested.
Okay, there's a lot in that question.
Yeah, sorry.
Opiates can be consumed in a lot of ways. Even things, for example, like pills that you might get from your doctor for hydrocodone or oxycodone, opioid-related medications, those can be just taken by mouth as they're usually prescribed, but it's not uncommon for us to see people take those pills, crush them up, dissolve them in liquid, draw them up into a syringe and inject them. It's also not uncommon for us to see those pills crushed and then heated, and people inhale the vapors from that, primarily as a means of getting the drug into their system more quickly. And there's lots of other reported ways that people use things, but those are probably the most three common ways that we see pills abused. People may directly inject just about any drug that's available in liquid form. Fentanyl certainly is. Fentanyl is also available in patches and lozenges and other forms. And so it can get into the system in a lot of different ways. In terms of what your body does with it, fentanyl in specific is metabolized primarily by your liver. There's what they call a CYP enzyme that is primarily responsible for the metabolism of fentanyl in your liver. That metabolism is felt to be mostly determined by how much blood is flowing through your liver. So the more blood flow you have to the liver, the more rapidly it will be metabolized. There are other ways that sometimes people will metabolize it more slowly, but based on what specific genes they have for metabolism, for that metabolizing enzyme. But mostly it's a function of how much blood is flowing through the liver. And it's then converted very quickly, has a very short half-life in the body, minutes, and is converted to a substance called norfentanyl, which then is eliminated in the urine. Don't know if that covered all
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Once it gets into the blood, then what's the intoxicating effect? I mean, how does that function?
Sure. So fentanyl in the blood distributes throughout the body. It's absorbed either through the mucosa, the lining of the mouth, or directly into veins, whatever. It gets into the bloodstream. And then from there, it gets into the brain, it gets into other organs, where it exerts its primary effects on the brain and the central nervous system, where it causes respiratory depression and or cessation. Can also cause central nervous system depression, meaning it alters the way you think, can make you groggy or less than normally responsive and things. But its primary lethal effects are related to its effects on your breathing, and it is dose dependent. So a higher dose will do this more readily than a lower dose, but it will either slow or stop your breathing, and sometimes that has lethal consequences.
The lethal consequences then are from stopping breathing?
Yes.
Okay. And when you stop breathing, death ensues. Does that metabolizing process continue to happen, or does that stop as well?
Generally, it will stop. There are, once your circulation stops and blood is no longer flowing through the liver, you're not going to have that continued metabolism through the liver. But there are a number of changes, large number of changes that are described in the way fentanyl is present in the body after death, that are related to changes in the pH of the body as you start to decompose, and other things that will influence what those levels look like.
When a person, I'm going to give you a hypothetical. So we have a decedent, and in the blood you and the lab personnel determine that there is quetiapine below the threshold of their tools. There is fentanyl at 15 nanograms per milliliter. And then in the gastric fluid, there is quetiapine at about 16,000 nanograms per milliliter, and fentanyl at 20,000 nanograms per milliliter. My question then is, based on that hypothetical, is there sufficient information for you to determine whether those two drugs were taken simultaneously or sequentially, and if sequentially, which one came first?
I can't tell you that.
There's just not enough information?
No, you can't derive that information from those values.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up. You said there's drowsiness as a consequence of taking, I assume, opioids of any type. Fentanyl just happens to be stronger?
Yes, fentanyl on a weight-by-weight basis, 1 milligram of fentanyl compared to 1 milligram of oxycodone or of morphine is sort of the usual reference standard because it is the classic opiate medication. Fentanyl is just much, much more potent, 80 to 100 times more potent than morphine.
So you said there's depression of the respiratory system, drowsiness. How quickly might one start to metabolize, given the fact that they take some fentanyl and it causes their death? Would they be able to metabolize at least some of it?
You would expect so, yes.
Okay.
I mean, there are a number of overdose deaths reported in the literature where the death occurs so quickly, and these are primarily in the setting of intravenous drug use, that no metabolism is able to be recorded because they just die too quickly. But generally speaking, we see some level of metabolism.
Let me see. I wanted to. But someone takes an overdose, a fatal dose of fentanyl. It's not then instantaneous death.
It depends partly. I mean, generally speaking, no. It's a function of the dose and the route of administration. So it's going to get into the system more quickly as an IV, or smoking will generally get it there pretty quickly as well. But ingestion would delay that somewhat. But different, however it gets into the body is going to determine how quickly that happens.
In this case, we have the two things, I think. One is there's some fentanyl in the stomach, the 20,000 nanograms.
Yes.
And also a measurement of, I know I'm saying it incorrectly, acetyl fentanyl.
Acetyl fentanyl, yes.
Does that information help you determine how it was ingested in this case?
It's suggestive that it's an oral ingestion. The presence of a large amount of fentanyl in the stomach, sort of the rough equivalent of several milligrams by volume is suggests that it was taken by that route, but there's not any way to definitely know that. There is some literature that suggests that the stomach will concentrate it, regardless of where it's from, but it is suggestive of that. And the presence of acetyl fentanyl in the stomach is also consistent with, is more consistent with this being illicit fentanyl than otherwise. Acetyl fentanyl is a variant of fentanyl that is, in our office, certainly we've only seen it in the setting of illicitly manufactured fentanyl.
When a body comes in for autopsy, in this case, Mr. Richins' body comes in, is it routine to check for injection sites?
Yes.
And
In this case in particular, there was visible pulmonary edema described at the scene, foam coming out of the mouth, and that is most commonly in somebody who didn't drown or have a history of heart failure is concerning for an opiate overdose, and so we would, in that case, do a thorough check for those.
Oh, for
injection
sites, and none found.
Again, I did not do the exam. None are described, and none were discussed by Dr. Ulmer.
Okay.
And I didn't see any in the photographs.
When you, in cases where you've seen an overdose death, particularly an accidental overdose death where you suspected inhalation, what's the sort of evidence that you would expect to see?
I'm not sure what you mean. Inhalation of the substance?
Of fentanyl or opioids.
Yeah, they all kind of look the same from that regard. You may see evidence that they've been smoking. Sometimes you'll see little burns on their fingers or other things from heating it up to smoke it, because they're not actually smoking it in the same way that you smoke a cigarette where you light it on fire and then you're inhaling the smoke. What actually is happening is that drug is being heated up and vaporized, and you're inhaling the vapors.
So, in those cases, do you tend to see evidence of that heating up? That is, tinfoil or torches? Or
certainly, yes, those things can be present at the scene.
Okay.
Commonly are seen at the scene.
Okay.